It's my very great pleasure to create this set of lectures on civil liberties for this refresher course. And my plan is in 3 or 4 short segments to uh, set out, first of all, some core conceptual issues relating to civil liberties, and secondly, to put them in some historical context, both in the US and the UK, and of course in India. And in addition, what I shall try and do is talk a little bit about the constitutional scheme in the Indian context within which civil liberties are to be protected, talk about some limitations of the constitutional protections that exist, and point out some contemporary challenges. I've also prepared this handout that uh, you have in front of you on the screen, and at the end of the handout, there are a list of there's an appendix with some further conceptual questions that I might not talk about, but you should take a look at if it's of interest to you. Uh, so the first set of questions um, I've titled Civil Liberties: What, Why, and How, and um, I'm going to begin by talking about what are civil liberties. And the main point um, to notice is, first of all, when people talk about civil liberties, they usually talk about um, a list, a list of rights of individuals, and that list has traditionally included things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religious practice, um, what are called um, due process protections um, against um, arbitrary state action through the criminal law. So, the right to a fair trial um, might be an example of one of these civil liberties. Um, and often these liberties are given some kind of constitutional protection through a Bill of Rights. And I'll show in a moment some examples of this. Um, it's important to see that the list is somewhat open ended. So, 100 years ago, perhaps the right to privacy um, wouldn't have been seen as a core civil liberty, but but now I think it would. So let me just um, show you some examples of classic civil liberties documents. The first being the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which is 1789 in connection with the French Revolution. And you can see some examples. There's um, there's number 7: no man should be accused, arrested, or held in confinement except in cases determined by the law and according to the forms which it has prescribed. And this is partly a defense against arbitrary or despotic action. Um, you have the presumption of innocence, every man being presumed innocent till he has been um, convicted. You have freedom of religious conviction, no man ought to be molested on account of his opinions, um, not even on account of his religious opinions. So it's freedom of speech and religion. You can see um, other examples of civil liberties on this list. Um, Famously, the US Constitution has a Bill of Rights that I think are probably part of popular consciousness even in India, especially the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an established of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So these are core classic civil liberties: freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. Um, you have take another example: rights in criminal cases, rights to a fair trial. Uh, the U.S. Constitution Bill of Rights dates to 1791. More recently, there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. This was part of the Charter of the United Nations. And you can see here, for instance, in Article 9, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. A right to a fair trial in Article 10, rights to freedom of movement in Article 13. Article 19 has the right to freedom of expression and opinion. And to give you the example from the Indian Constitution, which we'll talk about later in another segment of this lecture, Part 3 talks about Part 3 of the Constitution discusses various fundamental rights, and there's a subset of these rights which pertain specifically to civil liberties. For instance, you can see Article 91, citizens shall have the right to freedom of speech and expression, to assembly, to freedom of association. Other rights, for instance, famously, our due process right is Article 21, no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty except according to procedure, according to law. Right? So this is an overview or a set of examples of various constitutional documents protecting civil liberties. I should note in passing that you can have quite robust protections of civil liberties by a legal system even without a written constitution. And that was true, for instance, in the UK until quite recently. Now you'll notice that I showed a bunch of constitutional documents, and those documents had had many rights that traditionally would not be called civil liberties. So the traditional conception of civil liberties is quite narrow. So they are, as I note here, the rights of individuals, their rights against the state, and they involve the protection of quite central interests in what might be called personal liberty. So, for instance, the right to education, which is guaranteed in Article 21A of the Indian Constitution, would not count as a civil liberty. Rights against discrimination wouldn't count as civil liberties. Rights to equality of various kinds, though fundamental, would not be classified under this term. Now, the narrowness of this notion, I would argue, is both a feature and a bug. I'll talk later about the advantages of such a narrow formulation, but for now, just note that the restriction of civil liberties as rights against the state might be quite limiting, because in India, at least, it seems that the central interests protected by these traditional liberties may be threatened by, maybe even threatened more by private parties rather than the state. So think, for instance, about freedom of speech. There's lots of there are lots of restrictions on freedom of speech, which are not legal restrictions, but that arise from intimidation or violent protest against or boycotts of certain forms of speech, and a focus that is purely on limiting the power of the state may not be entirely effective in protecting these interests. And another problem with this narrow notion is that, again, I speak specifically of the Indian context that applies elsewhere as well, is that the violation of civil liberties might be made possible by other social, economic, and political circumstances, caste oppression, economic difficulty you may not have. You may not be able to afford a good lawyer, in which case you may not get a fair trial. So if you want to protect a fair trial, you might have to engage in work on the economic front or on the social front. And so the protection of civil liberties may require interventions in these areas. And, in fact, if you look at the track record of organizations devoted to the protection of civil liberties, you'll often find that there's a range of activities they engage in beyond protections of this list, though this is a contested matter, and I don't think different organizations at different points in history resolve it in different ways. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, is what are civil liberties. One can then ask, well, why protect them? Fine, there's this list, and in fact, there's a large philosophical literature, political literature devoted to just that question. And often one can't answer the question in the abstract, in the sense that they may be different civil liberties might have different rationales for their protection. The right to freedom of religious practice may be justified on grounds that don't apply to the right to freedom of speech in general, just to take one example. This is a theoretically rich and quite contested area. I'm just going to discuss just a couple of examples from the case of freedom of speech. So historically, in the what one might call the liberal tradition, John Stuart Mill claimed that free speech protection was important for consequentialist reasons. A society which protected free speech was more likely to advance at the truth. In the 20th century, the American constitutional scholar Alexander Michael-John argued that freedom of speech is essential for effective self-government. Others have thought that it's essential for forms of self-realization. Now they're very difficult theoretical issues involved in trying to carve out the precise form of these liberties. For instance, one might ask, should pornography or hate speech be given free speech protections? If not, why not? Should due process protections in the criminal law be relaxed for particularly heinous crimes? Right. So, should we have a separate set of weaker procedural protections for crimes of terrorism or of rape and murder? These tend to be these are controversial questions, which I think require urgent attention, and I don't think they get the attention that they deserve, actually, in the Indian context. I think the complexity of some of these issues is easy to miss, even though a lot of these central civil liberties issues are, in fact, very straightforward in some respects. Moving on to the question of how should one protect civil liberties. As I mentioned, these liberties are enshrined in various constitutional documents, and so formal democratic institutions, the judiciary and the legislature, for instance, are important bulwarks for their protection. However, constitutional protections on paper are not going to be much use unless they are institutions of civil society to agitate for their protection in the various fora, in the legislature, in the courts, in the public mind. These might include the media. They might include um, civil liberties associations, um, famously the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which was founded in 1920, and Liberty, which is an organization in the UK, founded in 1934 and originally called the National Council for Civil Liberties. Incidentally, both of these organizations had some interest in the Indian experience of colonialism and its aftermath. So, and that's an interesting story that um, really remains to be told in some detail. Now, and that's one reason why it's useful to look at these histories outside India, is to see that there's a really um, uh, an international aspect or a transnational aspect to the protections of these liberties. And different groups arise in different contexts and often in response to specific cases of injustice. So I'm just going to take you to the ACLU page, um, which talks about the history of the ACLU. And one finds that the early history of the ACLU had to do with um, dissent against um, uh, the First World War. So Roger Baldwin, who created the well, what eventually became the ACLU and was its president for many years, was an anti-war activist. He was a pacifist, and there was a good deal of persecution of such activists towards the end of the First World War. And that was the organization. That was the initial impetus for the organization, though it went on um, to work on many other issues. And we'll come to this in a later segment of the lecture. Um, Turning to the organization now called Liberty, that began out of uh, as a response to the observation that uh, there was police misconduct of various kinds at a national hunger march in 1932. And I'll just show you the initial letter that um, was written to a newspaper, the Manchester Guardian, now the Guardian newspaper, which mentions in the last paragraph um, that they recently formed a council for civil liberties. Um, it's an interesting list of names. If you see below this, um, many of them not well known today. Um, One thing I wanted to point out is that at least some of these names are literary figures. Lascelles, Abercrombie, A.P. Herbert, Harold Lasky was an academic, H.G. Wells, the famous writer. Why do I say this? Because sometimes there's an impression that civil liberties activists are, well, essentially professional activists or lawyers. The Prime Minister recently used the term Andolanjivi in the context of um, the farmers' protests. But in fact, traditionally, civil liberties activists have had all sorts of people, civil liberties organizations have had all sorts of people involved, not restricted to professional activists or lawyers. Famously, in the Soviet Union, some of the early, most famous dissidents were scientists, people like Andrei Sakharov. So that's an important point to keep in mind. Um, Let me take you to sorry, the Indian context, um, and really the current understanding of um, the history of civil liberties organization in India has been in the aftermath of the emergency, and there's a renewed set of there's a renewed interest in documenting the emergency. So if you go online, you'll find a bunch of original documents on the emergency. There are recent books written, for instance, by Christoph Jaffrelo, which will give some kind of context within which these were formed. Um, the most famous um, national ones, the PUCL and the PUDR, these were originally part of one organization which then split up. The Andhra Pradesh Civil Liberties Committee, the APCLC, has also been um, uh, very famous. And there's a recent book by um, K. Balagopal, who was its secretary for some part of uh, its tenure, which uh, I haven't read, but I recommend. Um, I'm just going to take you to the websites of PUCL and PUDR to give you a sense of what they're working on uh, right now. The Nagaland massacres, to take one example. Um, Here's the manifesto of uh, PUCL. There's the website of PUDR, and you can see that um, um, well, you can see on the left-hand column the range of issues that they are involved in: police firings, political prisoners, custodial death. So these are examples of state violence, but they also take up cases of caste, communalism. You see at the top is a letter from Gautam Lavlakha, who in fact is currently in custody. Um, he's I believe, the secretary of PUDR right now, or at least at some point, and has been one of the people arrested in the Bhima Koregaon case. To give you a little bit of historical background, there's an interesting website out of the University of Pune, which gives some documents from historical documents um, from the 70s and the 80s. So you'll see, for instance, documents from the early 70s on a range of issues. And the reason I point these out is that they give some texture both to the kinds of cases that civil liberties organizations have worked on, and in particular, the some historical development. Um, and it's worth seeing in the context. If you look at the first of these documents is from 77 and goes through here all the way to, if you go down to 2005. So a range of different political regimes have been the subject of political of organization by civil liberties organizations in India, and that's an important point to keep in mind, which I'll return to. Now, as it happens, that India has actually had quite a vibrant civil liberties movement before the emergency, but it's not actually well documented. Um, uh, what I think of the agitation against the Rowlatt Bills in 1919 as a form of civil liberties agitation, and I want to just show you a document that the PUCL brought out in 1984. It's called the Black Laws 1984, and it's a criticism of this terrorist affected areas ordinance. You see in the document has a reference to Gandhiji's letter on the Rowlatt Bills and the relevant extracts of the Rowlatt Act. I'm just going to go down to Gandhiji's letter on March 1, 1919, and his um, the Satyagraha pledge against the Rowlatt bills. And you'll see in this document, it's, there are other documents like this, um, uh, a reproduction of aspects of the Rowlatt Act and then comparisons with this particular ordinance that's being discussed. One tradition of civil liberties activism in India has focused on this contrast with the colonial past, and pointed out really ever since independence that in some respects at least, governments in independent India have have been more repressive than the colonial government, and in that sense, this has disappointed the promise of independence. There's some amount of rhetoric involved there, but I think in some respects that's probably true. I'll have to argue for it on a case by case basis. Um, in addition to Gandhiji's call in 1919, one can point out to the formation of the Indian Civil Liberties Union in 1936 by Jawaharlal Nehru, and I think Rabindranath Tagore was the first president of the ICLU, if I'm not mistaken. In the 40s and 50s, there was a vibrant civil liberties movement. I'm going to turn to a document from 1949 on civil liberties in India, and this conference also was a place at which the another civil liberties organization, the All India Civil Liberties Council, was formed, and you can see that the document lists examples of civil liberties violations in various parts of the country, in Bombay, East Punjab, West Bengal, and this is 1949, so the violations in question are violations by the government of independent India. One of the interesting things about this civil liberties organizing was that in some ways they were skeptical of the project of independence, of the nationalist anti-colonial project, because their focus was in arbitrary state action. They were less interested in the question of who was in charge. What matters is, whoever is in charge. If they're violating, if they're undertaking arbitrary state action, then that's a problem. And I'll just point you to a document, the Indian Civil Liberties Bulletin, that this is the first issue in October 1949, and this continued for, I think, about 15 years. And you can see that some elements of this, of course, there's a lot of context in the late 40s with partition and communist disturbances in Telangana. And one of the points of concern for civil liberties activists were these public safety acts, which allowed for preventive detention. But you see quite early on also an interest in freedom of speech. So the Press Act, the first, in fact, this is the case of the Crossroads. It's interesting. This is a 1949 document. The Crossroads case, which I'll talk about later on, was the first Supreme Court challenge to freedom of speech in India. Well, defense of freedom of speech in 1950 after the Constitution came into force. Okay, I think that's it for this segment of the lecture. I'll come back and in the next segment talk about some further conceptual issues and historical issues on civil liberties. Thank you.